Everyone wants things to be fair. And when we think that things aren't fair, well, we tend to complain about it. Sometimes a lot. We might even scream about it, at least on the inside. And if it happens to be happening directly to us, that we're the one taking that unfairness, we might even scream about it loud enough for other people to hear. My guess is if you stopped and think about it for a few minutes, you can probably think of a few examples of that, maybe more than a few, perhaps some that maybe you might even be in the middle of right now. And there's something in our souls that seems to push back when we see, or especially when we experience, injustice. So why, if we want things to be fair, is there so much unfairness and injustice in the world? I mean, you'd think that with everybody yearning for fairness, that we'd experience a bit more of it, but we don't. Because, as you've probably heard somebody say, when you're complaining about the unfairness of life, well, life isn't fair. And it isn't, is it? And it hasn't been since that first sin broke God's perfect world and made everyone a little selfish and self-centered and self-serving by nature. Injustice wasn't there in the beginning, but it's all over the place now. And it's just another part of the curse of sin. And Jesus takes that on himself too, as this Thursday evening now bleeds into the early hours of Friday morning. Jesus was arrested, and he was taken to the high priest's house for trial. And while behind the scenes, they're busy rigging the trial and trying to manufacture evidence against Jesus, here's what Luke records was happening to Jesus. I'm reading from Luke chapter 22, starting at verse 63. The guards in charge of Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and said, "Prophesy to us, who hit you that time?" They hurled all sorts of terrible insults at him. Now, how is that fair, or just, or right, or even decent? I mean, perhaps you've experienced some of that on a small scale, beaten up by other people's words as they try to make themselves bigger and seem more important than you by making you feel smaller and smaller. And they can get really mean about it sometimes, can't they? But usually you can at least walk away. And Jesus didn't. I mean, what's going on here is, for Jesus, this is going on all night. I mean, Jesus was arrested and he hadn't done anything wrong. And then instead of treating Jesus with at least some small amount of and shred of decency, they're calling Jesus name after name after name. They're making fun of Jesus over and over and over again. They're using some of the meanest, nastiest, most sarcastic words that they can think of, and they seem to be enjoying it. And then they're getting physical too. Not just beating Jesus up with words, which was painful enough, but they're beating Jesus up, period. I mean, they're hitting him hard. They're hitting him hard. They're hitting him over and over and over again, relentlessly pounding away at the same time that they're hurling all these insults at Jesus. And has Jesus done anything to deserve that sort of treatment? Of course not. The unfairness, the injustice of it all. And what does Jesus do in response to that? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Jesus just takes it. He endures it. Jesus suffers in silence. Reminds me of some things that the prophet Isaiah said hundreds of years before Jesus lived. Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6. I offered my back to those who beat me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. And then later on, chapter 53, verse 7, he was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As a sheep is silent before the shears, he did not open his mouth. And that was just the beginning. See, it got worse for Jesus from there. The guards are messing with Jesus, and while that's going on, the religious leaders are manufacturing this evidence, sort of a trial before the trial, the guilty verdict already determined by the time that a second trial could be held. And here's how Luke records that, starting at verse 66 of chapter 22.
At daybreak, all the elders of the people assembled, including the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. Jesus was led before this high council, and they said, "Tell us, are you the Messiah?" But he replied, "If I tell you, you won't believe me, and if I ask you a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated in the place of power at God's right hand." They all shouted, "So are you claiming to be the Son of God?" And he replied, "You say that I am." "Why do we need any other witnesses?" they said. "We ourselves heard him say it."
So that was trial number 2, the, quote, official one that happened at daybreak. And I'm wondering, well, so it's been going on all night. Why so early for that one? What's the rush? I mean, everybody's up all night. Don't they kind of need a rest or a break? I mean, they don't really care about Jesus. They don't care about Jesus getting any rest or recovery. They want to get Jesus, and they don't care how miserable Jesus gets in this process at all. But they've got to be tired. Why not just go home and take a nap first? Well, 2 reasons, I think. First of all, there are those Palm Sunday crowds that are camping out on the Mount of Olives to think about. See, they've had a long night of Passover celebration, and so that means they're likely sleeping in. And the religious leaders here, they want to take advantage of that. They don't want those Palm Sunday pilgrims to find out what's going on with Jesus until it's too late, and Jesus is already in the hands of the Romans and moving toward the cross. And the second thing is that they need to move this along rapidly, is they need to make it appear to be legal. I mean, now you'd think that shouldn't be an issue, and that religious leaders of all people should uphold not only the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. But at this point, they don't care about that at all. They don't care about injustice or unfairness, because it's just everywhere all over this. In fact, I want to show you something about the trial and the unfairness of it all. See, Jesus' trial was one that had the death penalty. And for the death penalty cases, there were very specific procedures that Jewish law was supposed to follow. Or at least it was supposed to be followed, because what Jesus actually experienced here is much different than what Jewish law prescribed. So in death penalty cases, Jewish law prescribed, first of all, that the trial had to happen during the day. When's Jesus' trial happening? What's going on all night? And then Jewish law said that this had to be a public trial if the death penalty was involved. This one's not public at all. It's held in secret. First at the house of Annas, then Caiaphas' house, and as they're meeting to get some of this incriminating information. Jewish law said you couldn't put someone under oath to incriminate themselves. But in Jesus' trial, that's exactly what Caiaphas does, puts Jesus under oath. Then in Jewish law, for death penalty cases especially, you were already also considered innocent and not even put on trial until there was what they might call a preponderance of evidence, until there was a substantial evidence of guilt, and it was established by witnesses, at least 2 or 3, who had not talked to each other before and who agreed exactly in every detail. What happened in Jesus' trial? Well, the verdict was predetermined, and the evidence was manufactured. The witnesses didn't agree in every little detail. And then the final thing is, in Jewish law, there was a one-day waiting period between when they deliberated and then when the verdict was actually announced. But here, it was immediate. Immediate. And right after that, boom, off to Pilate. Can you see, again, the injustice and the unfairness of it all over these trials? And again, what does Jesus do in response? Nothing. Nothing. Jesus just takes it. Jesus just endures it. Jesus just suffers in silence. And so they led him away to Pilate. Now, Paul tells us in Romans 13 that God established government, among other things, to stand for justice. To stand for justice and to protect the innocent. But what is the government, the Roman government, in this case, Pilate, the Roman governor, what does it do? It's supposed to protect the people's rights, and it ends up trampling all over them and railroading God's Son. But why'd they even need to bring Jesus to Pilate? I mean, true, the Romans were technically the only ones who were supposed to be able to execute someone, but the Romans, well, they were known to turn a blind eye and let the local authorities take care of their own problems. Stoning was on the books for religious crimes, which this was, and Jewish leaders could have gone that route. Could have gone that route without even informing the Romans, and the Romans, even if they had later found out about it, wouldn't have cared. Except there was more to those religious leaders' evil plan. You see, the religious leaders' plan was not just to kill Jesus, it was to disgrace Jesus. See, killing Jesus, well, it might make him a martyr in the eyes of some, and they couldn't have that. But if they could disgrace him, as well as kill him, that should put an end to things once and for all. Which is why the trip to Pilate here, because the Romans' preferred method of execution at this time was crucifixion. And crucifixion would brand Jesus as cursed in the eyes of most Jews in the day, and that would make Jesus both dead and disgraced. Problem solved from the point of perspective of the Jewish leaders. Dead and disgraced, that's definitely not something that the Son of God deserved. The unfairness, the injustice of it all. Not only how it ended up, that there's a guilty verdict for an innocent man, but even how they got there. I mean, check out what Luke records next as we turn the page to Luke chapter 23.
Then the entire council took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. They began to state their case. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government, and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "You have said it." Pilate turned to the leading priests and to the crowd and said, "I find nothing wrong with this man." Then they became insistent, "But he is causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem." "Oh, is he a Galilean?" Pilate asked. When they said that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law stood there shouting their accusations. Then Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally, they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before, became friends that day. Then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders along with the people, and he announced his verdict. "You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence and find him innocent." Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. So I will have him flogged, and then I will release him." Then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he demanded, "Why? What crime has he committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death, so I will have him flogged and then I will release him." But the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they demanded. As they had requested, he released Barabbas, the man in prison for insurrection and murder, but he turned Jesus over to them to do as they wished.
So Pilate has the reputation in some church circles for being, well, sort of a wimp, sort of a wishy-washy political cripple who caved rather easily. But actually, he wasn't. I mean, Pilate had already been governor here in Judea for 10 years. And that's in a place that was known as a trouble spot that chewed up governors and spit them out. Survive there. And you could easily make a career for yourself. And Pilate was nothing if not a survivor. But he'd also made a few mistakes in those 10 years that he was governor there. And the Jews used that to make trouble for him. And now Pilate's on probation from Caesar. And one more strike, meaning one more Jewish uprising, and Pilate's, well, he's in for early retirement with no pension plan. And that meant either exile or execution, and Pilate's not fond of either one of those. So the Jewish leaders know that. They know that, and they're going to use that to manipulate Pilate into getting what they want. So the injustice and the unfairness doesn't stop at the high priest's house. It goes right on into Pilate's court as well. Now, the Jewish leaders, they're not going to bring a religious charge against Jesus because Pilate wouldn't care about that. They bring up a political one. Let me read that to you again. They began to state their case. "This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king." So the charge, Jesus is telling people, don't pay up, don't pay your taxes. And the other charge is Jesus is setting himself up as some sort of an alternate ruler to Caesar. He's saying he's a king. And Caesar's not going to tolerate either one of those, is he? But now Pilate does his job here, and he does his due diligence, and he investigates things a little more fully, and he actually renders a verdict. Innocent. Pilate says Jesus is innocent, and that should have ended things right then and there if justice and fairness had anything to do with it, but it didn't. Justice and fairness is again nowhere to be found. The Jews had packed the courtroom, and they're turning up the heat here on Pilate. And so, Pilate, like the good political animal he is, punts. See, Pilate finds out that Herod is in town too, and Herod's kind of a figurehead ruler appointed by Rome who nominally governed Galilee, which is where Jesus was from. And so Pilate says, well, Herod, you decide. And Herod's all excited because he wants to see Jesus put on some sort of a miracle show, which he doesn't get. But he also says that Jesus isn't guilty. He says he's innocent. Now, he doesn't treat him like an innocent man, at least his soldiers don't, in a sort of a deja vu moment there. These soldiers, now, for a second time in this night, are treating Jesus poorly. They're spitting on him, they're whipping him, they're beating him, they're making fun of him. No way to treat an innocent man, is it? But then fairness and justice are just taking a holiday once again. But after Herod, he goes back to Pilate, and then Pilate again declares Jesus to be innocent. Right? So he's declared him innocent. Herod's declared him innocent. Pilate declares Jesus innocent again, which certainly should have settled things then and there, especially after Pilate had Jesus punished anyway. I mean, and it wasn't a slap in the face, a slap on the wrist sort of punishment. It was a cruel whipping and beating. And it was whipped so severely that it was, if Jesus could even recover, it was going to take him a long time to recover. And who knows, maybe Pilate was even thinking that might provide some sympathy for Jesus. What could this broken man do? What threat could he possibly be? Again, now that's not exactly fair to Jesus either, to whip an innocent man within an inch of his life. But at least some justice would, well, sort of prevail. If he survived the beating, at least an innocent man wouldn't die. Except justice and fairness didn't prevail. Not a bit. Because once again, the Jewish leaders didn't just want Jesus to be battered to a pulp. They didn't just want him killed. They needed Jesus to be disgraced. And for that, Jesus had to end up on a cross. And so they'd planned for every contingency. The crowd yelling for Barabbas to be freed and shouting, crucify him, about Jesus, they were almost certainly not that same group that was shouting Hosanna on Palm Sunday. This mob has all the marks of a deep fake, of a group of paid agitators strategically placed to ramp up the pressure on Pilate and to get him to give in to their demands concerning Jesus, which, well, Pilate did. Not immediately, but eventually. See, as I said before, Pilate was a survivor. And if it's him or Jesus, well, Pilate's going to choose himself every single time. And so once again, well, fairness flops. Fairness flops and injustice wins out over justice. Jesus has been declared innocent multiple times, but at the end of the day, when the trial's over, Jesus is heading toward a cross. The Jewish leaders get their way. The guilty, Barabbas, is set free, and the innocent, Jesus, is condemned to die. It just doesn't seem fair. And it isn't. No way, shape, or form is this fair or just. There's nothing fair about it at all. But Jesus willingly chose it. And Jesus willingly endured it. Because Jesus knew that we needed things to happen this way. Fairness does matter, and justice matters too, a lot. But love matters more. love matters more. And love is what moved Jesus to accept this unjust sentence and to keep marching toward a cross. And 2,000 years and counting, that sacrificial choice for love that Jesus made, it matters more than anything else in the world. It matters, well, on a couple of levels to us. See, if you're in one of those places where you're like Jesus, where you're alone, or you're isolated, when things don't work out the way that you want them to, or when you're ridiculed, when you're rejected, when you suffer unjustly, or when life is anything but fair, and you find yourself screaming, well, nobody cares, nobody knows how I feel, nobody gets this. Jesus stands up and says, I do. I do. And that helps. It helps to know that Jesus gets us. It helps to know that Jesus understands what we're going through. It helps to know that Jesus not only understands, but that Jesus is actually there to help us through it. And that's important. But there's something even more important that's going on here as Jesus becomes our substitute and accepts what for him is a totally unfair judgment. See, here's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus takes a punishment that should have rightfully been ours. You see, no matter how good we are, we're still not perfect. And that's a problem for us. Guilty, guilty, guilty is the sentence that we should have heard. But what we're going to hear instead, because of Jesus being our substitute, is not guilty. You're free to go. The verdict's already been delivered. Jesus stood in. He stood in your place, and he took it on himself, and he took the guilty sentence that we deserved. And so, in this week in the life of Jesus, there's one more step to take. One more step to take, one final road to walk before it is finished. Jesus knows that this courtroom must lead to a cross. That it must lead to a cross where the injustice and unfairness of it all comes down like a hammer on the head of the innocent Son of God. And Jesus lets that happen. He could have walked away. And he let the hammer of injustice or of God's justice against sin come down on himself. All because of love. And that was always part of God's deeper plan. You see, it was a rescue plan that God put in motion and told us about from almost the moment that Adam and Eve first sinned and messed up. The rescue plan was that because we could not rescue ourselves, that God would send a rescuer for us. He'd send a rescuer, someone to take our place, someone to take on our pain, someone to carry the curse, all of it, so that one day the curse could be completely gone, and someone to take our punishment, to take the judgment of against sin upon himself, and carry a load that we could not, and bear a penalty that we couldn't bear. And by his innocent suffering on the cross, purchase forgiveness. Purchase forgiveness and help us reconnect with God. You see, the wages of sin is death. But Isaiah was also right when he wrote this. Isaiah 53, verse 5. He was wounded for our rebellious acts. He was crushed for our sins. He was punished so that we could have peace. And we received healing from his wounds. Jesus knew that we needed that we needed him. And so, on to Calvary.